Was the explosion the most dangerous part of the drone strike? No. The real danger was the distance. Just 6 kilometers from the Kremlin, barely 3.7 miles. Close enough to turn a local incident into a national nightmare. In the early hours of May 4th, 2026, a Ukrainian drone slammed into a luxury high-rise near Mosfilmovskaya Street in Moscow, just days before Russia's Victory Day parade. Streets were sealed, residents evacuated, emergency teams sifted through broken glass and debris. Russia's defense ministry claimed 117 drones were intercepted that night. But the number that truly matters isn't 117, it's 6. One small cheap drone forced the entire Russian security machine to wake up in panic. Air defenses scrambling, police locking down districts, state media spinning, and officials visibly rattled. This was not merely an attack on a building, it was an attack on the comforting illusion that Moscow still sits safely above the war. Putin doesn't just need to protect the capital, he needs the capital to look calm while the world watches. Ukraine doesn't need to capture Moscow to change the war. It only needs to make Moscow feel that the war has finally come home. Moscow is more than a capital city, it is Putin's main stage. It is where history becomes theater. Fear becomes loyalty, and power is sold as destiny. Every parade on Red Square, every broadcast from the Kremlin walls, every carefully lit image sends one message to the Russian public: the heart of Russia remains untouchable, strong, protected, in control. That is why the drone strike near Mosfilmovskaya Street matters far beyond broken glass and scattered debris. The drone hit concrete, but the message hit the regime. For years, Putin has sold Russians one central bargain: the war is real, painful, and necessary, but it will not reach you. Ukrainian cities can burn, Russian soldiers can die in the mud of Donbass, villages can empty, cemeteries can fill. But Moscow, with its luxury towers, elite restaurants, wide avenues, and shining skyline, remains above the smoke. That belief is not a side detail, it is part of regime stability. It allows the middle class and the elite to keep working, shopping, flying, paying taxes and pretending the war is something happening somewhere else. Then a drone reaches a luxury high-rise near central Moscow. Suddenly the protective bubble cracks. These towers are not random buildings, they represent the winners of Putin's system. The people inside were supposed to be insulated from the consequences of imperial ambition. When debris from that world falls onto the street below, the message becomes impossible to hide. The war has crossed the invisible line between the protected center and the expendable periphery. The provinces were always expected to bleed, Moscow was not. The Kremlin will try to shrink the incident. Officials will speak of no casualties, limited damage, and successful interceptions of 117 drones nationwide. That language is designed to make the event sound technical, contained, almost routine. But psychological warfare does not work that way. Impact is not measured only by deaths or craters, it is measured by reaction. Streets sealed, residents evacuated, emergency teams moving through broken glass, police locking down districts, state media spinning the story. Security officials forced to explain how a flying object reached one of the most guarded urban areas in Russia. One small drone forced a giant state to show its nerves. This is the brutal new math of the war. The attacker does not need to destroy everything. He only needs to make the defender protect everything. Every apartment tower becomes a potential headline. Every airport becomes a vulnerability. Every public ceremony becomes a security gamble. Russia can spend billions on radar, electronic warfare, layered air defense, and police lockdowns. But the political damage begins the moment ordinary people look up and wonder whether the next sound in the sky belongs to another drone. Fear does not need a massive warhead, it needs proximity. And proximity is the point. 6 kilometers from the Kremlin is not just a map detail, it is humiliation measured in distance. It tells Russians that the wall between the war zone and the capital is no longer solid. It tells the Kremlin that controlling the narrative is harder when the evidence lands near the center of power. It tells the world that Moscow is no longer watching this war from a sealed balcony. Moscow is now inside the psychological range of the conflict. That is why the timing cuts so deep. The strike came just days before Victory Day. Putin's most sacred annual ritual of power, legitimacy, and national unity. This is the day he needs Moscow to look calm, grand, and untouchable. But instead of preparing a flawless spectacle, the Kremlin is managing restricted airspace, heightened security, nervous officials, and the visible absence of heavy military hardware. The parade has not even started, and already the mood has changed. Putin does not need to physically lose Moscow to lose control of the story. He only needs Moscow to stop feeling untouchable. Once the symbolic heart of his regime begins to experience the war, the strongest myth sustaining his rule starts bleeding in public. The drone hit a building. But the real target was the lie that Moscow would never have to pay for Putin's war. A country does not need to lose an airport for its aviation system to feel under siege. It only needs enough uncertainty in the sky to make air traffic controllers hesitate. Pilots wait on the ground, passengers stare anxiously at departure boards, and officials choose safety over normal operations. That is exactly what happened on the night of May 3rd to 4th, 2026. Multiple Russian airports, including Vnukovo and Sheremetyevo near Moscow, Pulkovo in St. Petersburg, and airports in Kostroma, Pskov, Nizhny Novgorod, and Kaliningrad's Khrabrovo, suddenly imposed restrictions and schedule changes. This was not a single isolated incident. It was a network effect spreading across European Russia and the Baltic exclave. Ukraine did not need to destroy runways or shoot down airliners. It only needed to make Russian airspace feel unsafe enough that the system began to slow itself down. That is the quiet genius of asymmetric warfare, for an ordinary Russian or even an American trying to understand the impact. Imagine drone warnings causing simultaneous delays at Washington, Dulles, New York, JFK, Chicago, O'Hare, and Dallas-Fort Worth in the same night. No terminal needs to explode, no civilian plane needs to be hit. The disruption itself becomes the weapon. Business meetings are canceled, cargo shipments are delayed, families sleep on airport floors. Airlines burn extra fuel circling or idling. Security forces chase shadows. Every delay breeds rumors. Every rumor becomes a political question. If the government cannot keep civilian skies normal, what else is slipping out of control? This is where the cost equation becomes brutal for Russia. A single cheap drone does not need to be expensive to impose an enormous strategic cost. When one small system forces air defense crews onto high alert police into lockdowns, airport managers into emergency protocols, media teams into damage control, and regional governors into public explanations, the real expense is not the drone. The real expense is the reaction it triggers. Russia must defend a vast territory with thousands of kilometers of borders, major cities, energy, infrastructure, military bases, ports, refineries, bridges, and now its entire civilian aviation network. The defender's map keeps growing larger. The attacker's weapon can remain small and cheap. Airports are especially powerful psychological targets because they are symbols of normal life and national capability. They tell citizens that the country still functions, that planes take off on time, that business continues, and that the state remains in charge. When that rhythm breaks, even temporarily, people feel it physically. A man stuck at Vnukovo does not need military doctrine to understand fear. A mother stranded at Pulkovo does not need propaganda to feel anxiety. They only know one thing. Something in the sky made the state change its behavior. That is how a distant war suddenly becomes personal. The Kremlin understands this danger, which is why it tries to compress every incident into dry technical language: temporary restrictions, safety measures, drones intercepted, no major consequences. Those words are anesthesia meant to numb the public. But aviation disruptions are difficult to hide. A closed street can be explained. A damaged building can be photographed from a favorable angle. A delayed flight, however, creates hundreds of frustrated witnesses holding phones, tickets, and anger. The story escapes the state's script and spreads through people. This is the second front Ukraine has successfully opened inside Russia's mind. The first is symbolic striking near the Kremlin. The second is systemic forcing airports, air defenses, police, media, and public confidence to react simultaneously to the same threat. Putin built his war on distance and separation. Distance between Moscow and the battlefield. Distance between elites and ordinary suffering. Distance between triumphant television images and battlefield reality. Drone warfare is collapsing all those distances at once. One night of airport chaos will not defeat Russia, but it teaches every Russian a new uncomfortable lesson. The war is no longer just something they watch on television. It is something that can quietly interrupt their daily lives. Victory Day is not just a holiday in Putin's Russia. It is the annual performance where the Kremlin tells the country who it is supposed to be. Tanks rolling across Red Square, columns of soldiers, fluttering flags, marching boots, elderly veterans, roaring fighter jets, overhead solemn speeches, and the blood-red walls of the Kremlin. All of it serves one purpose: to fuse the glorious memory of 1945 with the power of today's regime. Putin does not stand there as a mere president. He stands as the self-proclaimed guardian of Russia's historical destiny. That is why May 9th is sacred. It is not only about the past. It is a weapon aimed at the present. But in 2026, that weapon is beginning to shake in Putin's hands. The parade arrives in the shadow of drone strikes near Moscow, airport restrictions across European Russia, heightened security, and reports that the Kremlin has chosen for the first time in nearly 2 decades to remove heavy military vehicles from Red Square. That absence speaks louder than any official explanation. A spectacle built to project raw strength now has to hide some of the very machines that usually define it. The message is no longer clean. The image is no longer effortless. The state is still performing power, but it is performing under visible pressure. This matters deeply to Washington, Warsaw, Berlin, and every NATO capital watching from afar. Putin does not simply need the parade to happen. He needs it to look safe. He needs the cameras to capture control, not anxiety. He needs foreign dignitaries and his own people to see a capital that feels sealed off from the war, not a capital constantly checking the sky. In the world of propaganda, humiliation is not always a destroyed building. Sometimes it is a security posture so obvious that everyone can see exactly what the regime is afraid of. Putin's problem is not only drones, his problem is optics. The timing turns the knife even deeper. A drone incident in August would be a security issue. A drone incident days before Victory Day becomes a political statement. Airport restrictions in a normal week would be an inconvenience. Airport restrictions right before the grandest military ritual of the year become proof that the state is tightening its own nervous system. Ukraine does not need to physically disrupt the parade to shape the mood around it. The question has already been planted in millions of minds. If Moscow must lock down its skies before its most sacred ceremony, then how untouchable is Moscow really? Every choice now carries a cost. If the parade is large and aggressive, it risks looking reckless. If it is smaller and more cautious, it confirms weakness. If heavy equipment is missing, the world notices. If security is overwhelming, the world notices. If air defenses are visibly active, the world notices. The Kremlin can still control the choreography on Red Square, but it cannot fully control what that choreography now reveals. For Americans, this is easy to understand. Imagine a president preparing the most important national security ceremony of the year while drone warnings circulate near Washington and major airports face sudden restrictions. Even if nothing catastrophic happens, the entire event changes. The tone of the speech shifts. Camera angles are adjusted, the security perimeter expands, the public mood darkens, strength begins to look defensive, confidence begins to look staged. That is the psychological lever Ukraine is pulling so effectively. It is not trying to outparade Russia. It is forcing Russia to pay an ever higher price just to pretend that everything is still normal. Putin built Victory Day to tell Russians that sacrifice produces glory, that obedience produces security, and that the state stands invincible above fear. Drone warfare is rewriting that script in real time. It turns the parade from a celebration of control into a stressful test of control. It forces the Kremlin to spend political capital defending the stage before the show even begins. The flags may still fly, the soldiers may still march, Putin may still deliver his speech in that familiar heavy tone. But beneath the ceremony lies a new uncomfortable reality. Moscow is no longer outside the psychological reach of the war it launched. This is why May 9th, 2026 feels different. The real question is no longer whether Putin can hold the parade. The question is what the parade now reveals about a power that must defend its own victory ritual from the sky. This wasn't just about one drone, one building, or one night of airport chaos. It was about distance collapsing. The distance between the war in Moscow, the distance between Putin's grand speeches and Russia's daily reality. The distance between a regime that promises total control and a capital now forced to look nervously at the sky. For years, Putin maintained two separate worlds. One world suffered and bled in Ukraine, while the other, Moscow, watched from a safe, polished distance. One buried its sons, the other held parades, one lived under constant threat, the other was told it would always remain untouchable. That wall is cracking. Ukraine does not need to march into Red Square to change this war. It only needs to prove that Moscow is no longer outside the consequences of the decisions made inside the Kremlin. A single small drone can force a giant state to reveal its fear. A few delayed flights can expose systemic fragility. A Victory Day parade that looks tense and defensive can say more than 1,000 triumphant speeches. Putin can still stand on Red Square, the flags can still rise, the soldiers can still march. But the old message has changed. Russia is no longer simply projecting strength. It is now busy defending the image of strength. And there is a profound, dangerous difference between the two. Because once a regime must spend more energy protecting its myth than proving its power, the myth has already begun to fail. The real question is no longer whether Moscow can survive a drone strike. It can. The deeper question is whether Putin can survive a war that keeps moving closer to the story he has built about himself and his country. What do you think? Is this just a temporary security scare or the beginning of a new phase where Moscow itself is becoming part of the battlefield? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to hear your take. If you enjoy clear, no-nonsense analysis of the war, feel free to subscribe and join us for the next one.